They were born on a storm-soaked night in 1829, in a Kentucky cabin lit only by a trembling lamp. Two cries rose together, two voices bound in one body. From that moment, the world could not decide what they were: miracle, curse, or mistake of nature. Doctors came with notebooks, preachers with warnings, and strangers with coins, but none could truly understand them. They lived as both spectacle and secret, chained by flesh yet divided in spirit. This is the haunting story of the twins that medicine feared, that faith condemned, and that history tried to forget. The night was heavy with rain when the twins came into the world. A storm rolled across the Kentucky hills, the kind that makes the earth feel restless, the kind that rattles loose windows and bends the trees until they groan. Inside a one-room cabin, lit only by the trembling glow of an oil lamp, a young woman cried out in labor. Her voice mixed with the thunder, a sound both desperate and defiant, as if she knew this birth would be no ordinary one. The midwife worked with steady hands, but her eyes betrayed something else: hesitation, fear. She had seen many births in these parts, in cabins just like this one, but never one that carried the weight of mystery. When the first infant emerged, gasping and slick with life, relief flickered across the room. But when the second came, joined, inseparable, silence fell. For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the roof. Then a thin wail broke through. Not one but two voices rising together. The twins cried in unison, a strange, dissonant harmony that unsettled even the most seasoned hands in the room. The midwife crossed herself. The grandmother whispered an old prayer under her breath. And the young mother, pale and exhausted, reached out her trembling arms, not in fear but in instinct, in love. She pulled the boys close, pressing their warm bodies against her own. Joined or not, they were hers. But outside those cabin walls, the world would not see them that way. Word spread quickly through the rural town. A double birth was a rarity in itself, but conjoined twins, this was something else entirely. The neighbors came to the door under the guise of offering help, but their eyes betrayed their real intent: curiosity, fear, suspicion. They lingered too long, whispering to one another in hushed tones as though the infants might overhear. Some called them a wonder. Others called them an omen. In a land steeped in faith and superstition, difference was rarely greeted with kindness. By morning the story had already grown. Some said the twins were born with two souls trapped in one body. Others insisted it was a punishment from God, a mark of hidden sin. The cabin became less a home and more a site of fascination, a place whispered about in church pews and along dirt roads. Yet inside, life was quieter. The young mother, weary but determined, refused to see them as anything less than human. She named them, clothed them, nursed them. She watched as their tiny hands curled around one another, not out of choice, but out of the strange, inescapable design of their existence. Still, there was a weight in the air that even she could not deny. For every tender moment, there lingered the shadow of what lay ahead: the stares, the judgments, the cruel questions that no one yet dared to voice. And so, on that storm-soaked night in 1829, the twins that doctors could not understand began their lives not in celebration, but in silence. A silence that would follow them, haunt them, and shape everything that was still to come. As the boys grew, the silence of that stormy night was replaced by the sound of whispers that never seemed to end. Every step beyond their cabin doors turned into a theater of eyes. Farmers halted their plows, children froze mid-play, and conversations cut short as the twins passed by. The air carried a strange tension, half pity, half horror, as though the very sight of them demanded people choose between marveling or recoiling. They were not boys, not yet, but curiosities. And in the cruelty of rural life, curiosities rarely thrived. Their mother tried to shield them. She walked with her head high, clutching their small hands as though daring the town to speak aloud what it muttered in secret. But even she could not erase the sting of being watched. The boys felt it in the way strangers' eyes lingered on their joined bodies, in the way doors closed just a little quicker when they neared. To some, they were miracles. To others, walking proof of divine punishment. The twins themselves learned to read faces faster than words, because every expression told them what the world thought of their existence. At church, pews creaked as families shifted away, subtle but deliberate. When hymns rose, voices faltered if the twins sang too loudly, as though their voices somehow tainted the sacred air. They would return home in silence, their mother's jaw clenched, her knuckles white around the family Bible. No one dared bar them from the Lord's house, but no one welcomed them either. Faith, like fear, could cut sharper than any knife. Children were less restrained. They stared openly, giggling or pointing until a parent yanked them back by the wrist. The twins longed to join games in the dusty streets, but when they approached, balls rolled away and laughter turned brittle. They learned to invent their own diversions in the woods and fields near their home, chasing shadows, building forts from fallen branches, and creating a world where no one could look at them with those questioning eyes. It was in those woods that they laughed most freely, laughter that was not only joy but rebellion. But rebellion has its limits. At night, when the lamps were dim and their mother's breath finally slowed in sleep, the boys whispered to each other. They asked the questions no one else dared to answer. Why joined? Were they being punished for something they had never done? They could not untangle the truth from the superstitions that surrounded them. All they knew was that their lives were already marked, written about in murmurs before they could even write their own names. And so they grew up under the weight of stares, eyes that measured them, defined them, diminished them. Yet inside that weight, a stubborn spark endured. For though the world treated them as spectacle, the twins began to sense something the town could not see, a bond forged not by choice but by survival. It would be their greatest strength, and their greatest burden. Though the twins were bound in flesh, their spirits diverged in ways that seemed almost cruel. One carried the fire of restlessness, eyes always darting to the horizon, legs eager to chase the unknown, voice quick to argue. The other was quieter, content to linger in familiar places, a boy who found peace in silence and who recoiled from the chaos of crowds. Yet they could not escape one another. When one yearned to move, the other was dragged along. When one longed to stay, the other was forced into stillness. Their differences sharpened with age. A simple decision, whether to wander down to the river, whether to greet the neighbors, whether to join in chores, became battles of will. Their arguments rarely ended with compromise. They ended in silence, a heavy kind of silence that pressed down on their small home like storm clouds refusing to break. And because distance was impossible, there was no retreat, no solitude, no escape. Anger, when it flared, had nowhere to go but inward. Doctors began to appear, summoned by whispers of the strange children in Kentucky. Some came with genuine curiosity, carrying notebooks filled with sketches, hands trembling with excitement as though the twins were puzzles to solve. Others arrived with colder motives, regarding the boys not as children but as specimens. They prodded with fingers that were too rough, measured with tools that seemed more suited for livestock than human flesh, and whispered in jargon that only deepened the boys' unease. Yet after all their examinations, no answers came. The twins remained what they had always been, a mystery that confounded both science and superstition. For the brothers, the visits left scars that were not visible. Each time a physician left, they carried the echo of words they did not fully understand, words like separation, abnormality, deformity. They heard them enough to know they were not words meant for ordinary boys. Those words lodged in their minds, reshaping the way they saw themselves. Were they broken? Were they unnatural? Or were they simply what they were meant to be? And yet, for all their conflict, there were moments when the bond between them revealed itself as something deeper than flesh. When illness struck, they leaned on one another, each heartbeat a reassurance the other was still there. When fear crept into the night, they whispered until exhaustion pulled them both into the same uneasy sleep. In those quiet hours, when the world outside was muted and the fire burned low, their differences mattered less. What mattered was that neither was alone in the darkness. But daylight always returned, and with it, the friction of two lives forced into one path. One brother's longing to run clashed with the other's yearning to stay. Their bond was unbreakable yet fragile, an unending paradox. They were brothers, companions, rivals, prisoners, and protectors all at once. And though they could not yet understand it, that tension, the battle between freedom and restraint, between unity and individuality, would follow them for the rest of their days. By the time the twins reached their early teens, their existence had become more than a local curiosity. They were no longer just the strange boys in the Kentucky hills. They were a living riddle that traveled beyond their town through sermons, rumors, and scattered medical journals. And with that spread came a question that divided both pulpit and parlor. Were they a mistake of nature or a message from God? On Sundays, the church pews grew heavy with unease. Some preachers thundered that the twins were proof of divine punishment, evidence that sin had seeped into the bloodline, manifesting in bodies bound together like a warning carved in flesh. They quoted scripture with trembling voices, urging the congregation to repent lest more such monstrosities be born. The twins sat through these sermons in silence, feeling every word strike them like stones, even as their mother's hand gripped theirs tighter, daring anyone to cast them out. But not all men of faith condemned them. A few gentler voices rose, insisting the boys were no curse but a test of compassion. If God made them this way, one whispered, then perhaps our judgment is the sin. Yet such voices were easily drowned out. In an age where fear often roared louder than love, kindness rarely held the floor for long. Science, too, offered no refuge. Physicians from distant towns arrived with their leather satchels and heavy coats, claiming the authority of progress. They measured the boys with calipers, pressed stethoscopes against their shared rib cage, and filled pages with careful sketches. Some treated them as curiosities, others treated them like broken machines to be studied, dissected in theory if not in practice. They spoke of malformations and unnatural unions of flesh, words clinical and cold, words that stripped away humanity and replaced it with spectacle. And in the uneasy overlap of God and science, the twins found no answers, only debate, speculation, and fear. Their lives were not their own, they were battlegrounds where belief and reason clashed. Each sermon, each examination, seemed less about the boys themselves and more about what others wanted to see in them: sin, miracle, or anomaly. Yet in the quiet hours of night, when the fire dwindled and the house fell still, those arguments melted away. The boys whispered their own questions. Did God mean for them to suffer? Did the world of doctors truly understand more than their mother's embrace? If they were mistakes, why had they survived the fragile years of infancy when so many others had not? No preacher, no physician could answer those questions. Only silence answered. Silence and the steady rhythm of their shared heartbeat. And still, outside their walls, the world whispered. The preachers prayed. The doctors returned. Neither faith nor science could agree on what the twins truly were. But both forces, powerful and unrelenting, circled closer and closer. And in that circling, the boys began to sense an unsettling truth. Their lives would never belong solely to them. The hills of Kentucky could not contain the whispers forever. Word of the strange twins, bound together in flesh, drifted down dirt roads and across rivers until it reached the ears of men who smelled opportunity where others saw tragedy. Traveling merchants, carnival agents, and medicine show barkers began to appear at the cabin door, hats in hand and smiles too wide, offering promises wrapped in greed. They spoke in honeyed tones. These boys, they said, are a wonder the world deserves to see. A living marvel. A gift. Behind the flattery was a truth too sharp to hide. What they wanted was profit. They imagined the twins under the glare of lanterns, crowds pressing forward with coins clenched in sweaty fists, gawking as if at a two-headed calf or a bottle of moonlight. Humanity stripped away, dignity sold by the ticket. The family resisted at first. Their mother's voice was steady, though her heart trembled. She told the men no again and again and shut the door firmly against their grins. But poverty has a way of prying open doors that pride tries to keep closed. The crops had been poor that season. Work was scarce. The boys were growing, their appetites larger, their needs heavier. To hide them from the world meant protecting their souls, yes, but it also meant staring down the gnawing hunger that came with each winter. The twins themselves felt the weight of the dilemma. One recoiled at the thought of standing before strangers, of being reduced to a spectacle. The other, restless and hungry for something beyond the same fields and faces, wondered if perhaps there was a strange kind of freedom in it. Travel, new places, a chance to see beyond Kentucky's narrow horizons. Yet neither desire could exist without the other. Joined as they were, compromise meant both winning and both losing. And so the offers kept coming, each man promising more than the last. A life of fame. A steady income. A chance to step out of the shadows and into history. But the price was clear. They would belong to the gaze of the crowd. They would no longer be brothers, no longer even boys. They would be an exhibit. At night, when their mother sat by the fire staring into the flames, her face was etched with a war between shame and desperation. She prayed for guidance, but the silence of the cabin answered her prayers with nothing more than the crackle of burning wood. How does a mother protect her children when the world will not allow them to be seen as children at all? And so, with each knock on the door, with each offer whispered like temptation, the family inched closer to a choice that would alter everything. To keep the twins hidden meant to starve in silence. To reveal them meant to surrender them to the cruel curiosity of strangers. And when the hunger in their bellies grew louder than the whisper of conscience, the decision could no longer be delayed. The first journey began with little more than a wagon and a promise. The air was damp with spring rain as the family watched their modest belongings loaded into crates. The boys huddled together beneath a rough woolen blanket. They did not speak much. For children who had been guarded so carefully, the sudden uprooting felt less like an adventure and more like a surrender. Their mother's face betrayed the truth. her lips pressed into a line too thin to be mistaken for hope. When they reached the first town, the arrangement was already in motion. A tent had been erected in the square, its canvas walls flapping like the skin of some great beast. Posters screamed their existence before they had even stepped inside. The marvel of Kentucky. 2 souls in one body. A wonder of nature. Strangers lined the streets, coins ready, their voices rising in fevered chatter. To the crowd, the boys were not children. They were the main event. The curtain lifted and a hush fell heavy. Gasps escaped from lips both horrified and entranced. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men leaned forward with unblinking eyes, and somewhere in the crowd a woman fainted outright. The twins stood beneath the lantern's glow, their small hands clenched, their faces still. They learned quickly that stillness was their only shield. If they moved too much, the crowd stirred like a restless sea, leaning closer, whispering louder. To stand frozen was to reclaim in some small measure their dignity. Night after night the routine repeated. The tent filled, the curtain rose, the audience stared. Some pointed and muttered prayers, others laughed cruelly, their jeers cutting like blades. A few looked on with genuine awe, their faces softening with something like pity. But pity too was a prison. For the twins, every gaze felt the same, an invasion, a theft. Their bodies had become currency, their existence reduced to the price of admission. And yet, the world beyond Kentucky was suddenly theirs to see. They traveled from dusty towns to bustling cities, each new place carrying its own strange rhythms and smells, coal smoke in the air, the sharp tang of horse sweat, the sweetness of candied nuts sold on corners. They saw rivers wider than any they had imagined, buildings that scraped at the sky, crowds so thick they moved like one living organism. For a boy who had once stared at the horizon with restless eyes, it was intoxicating. For his quieter brother it was suffocating. The chain of flesh between them pulled tighter than ever before. Behind the curtains, when the lanterns dimmed and the crowd dispersed, the boys returned to their mother's side. She stroked their hair, whispered comforts, and tried to remind them of who they were beyond the gawking eyes. But she, too, could not ignore the clinking of coins in the showman's hand, the cruel arithmetic of survival. The twins belonged to themselves in those moments of tenderness, but only until morning when the curtain rose again. For the journey into exhibition had begun, and there was no path back to silence. Beneath the bright lanterns and the roar of the crowd, the twins learned the art of stillness. But behind the curtains, in the dim hours when the noise of the world faded, their existence was nothing but motion, 2 lives constantly rubbing against one another, never able to part. Every moment was shared. The rhythm of their breath, the pangs of hunger, the twisting of sickness, what touched one touched the other. Privacy was a word they knew only from overhearing others, a concept belonging to everyone but themselves. When one longed for silence, the other hummed songs to pass the time. When one dreamed of running free through open fields, the other resisted with every weary step. Compromise became their only language, a fragile truce negotiated day by day. At night, their bodies curled together in the same narrow bed, their limbs tangled not out of choice but necessity. They listened to each other's breathing until sleep came, heavy and reluctant. Sometimes they spoke in whispers, not the kind meant for secrets, but the kind meant to keep loneliness at bay. They learned to finish each other's sentences, to predict each other's thoughts, to sense each other's moods before words were spoken. Survival demanded it. Yet intimacy carried its own poison. Resentment brewed quietly, a shadow stretching between them. One felt suffocated by the endless tether, the constant reminder that no step, no thought, no moment belonged solely to him. The other clung to the bond, fearful of what might happen if distance were possible. They argued in hushed tones that no crowd could hear, their words sharp as knives. And when silence followed, it was the silence of 2 prisoners locked in the same cell, each blaming the other for the walls. The world outside offered no relief. Strangers paid to gape at them, but those stares never captured the truth, the exhaustion of always being seen and yet never being known. The boys longed for someone to look beyond their joined bodies, to see them as more than marvels or mistakes. But such recognition rarely came. Instead, they became experts at hiding pain, at presenting unity to the crowd, even as they wrestled with division in private. Still, there were moments of grace. A shared laugh over some small absurdity. A look exchanged that needed no words. The way they instinctively leaned on one another when the jeers grew too loud, finding strength in the very bond that chained them. These fleeting sparks of brotherhood reminded them of something vital, that despite the resentment, despite the conflict, neither was truly alone. And so, through a fragile balance of defiance and dependence, the twins carved out a rhythm of survival. But deep beneath the surface, questions festered. How long could they endure the weight of living two lives in one body? How long before their bond, both lifeline and prison, began to tear? By the time the twins reached young manhood, whispers of their condition had traveled far beyond dusty towns and traveling tents. Physicians who fancied themselves pioneers of a new age of science came knocking, carrying polished instruments and a dangerous kind of confidence. They spoke of discovery, of progress, of possibilities. And behind their polished words lingered the same unspoken idea. What if they could be separated? The notion was not whispered gently. It was delivered with the fervor of men who believed themselves masters of life and death. The doctors sketched diagrams, sharp ink scratching across parchment, as though the twins were problems to be solved with lines and scalpels. They spoke of cutting flesh, of untangling organs, of proving what medicine had never dared attempt. Their voices carried the chill of ambition more than compassion. The boys listened in silence, their faces pale beneath the lamplight. They had endured stares, endured the indignity of exhibition, but this was different. This was not curiosity. It was threat. To the doctors, their bodies were not homes, not vessels of life. They were puzzles to be taken apart, regardless of the cost. And the cost was clear. Even the boldest physicians admitted separation would almost certainly mean death. Perhaps for both, perhaps for one, no one could say. The boys were young, but they understood enough. To be cured meant to risk annihilation. To stay as they were meant to live beneath the weight of judgment and exploitation. There was no path untouched by suffering. Their mother, aged now and worn by years of worry, wept at the very mention of surgery. She saw in the doctor's eyes not salvation, but hunger, the hunger for fame, for the glory of achieving what no man had dared before. She clutched her sons tighter, her voice sharp with a mother's fury, swearing no blade would ever touch them. But her protests did little to silence the growing murmur in society. For the crowds who had once paid to gawk at the twins, the idea of separation carried its own kind of morbid fascination. They debated it in taverns and parlors, speculating whether the brothers could live apart, whether one would survive, whether the experiment would confirm God's design or man's mastery. To them, the lives of the twins were no more than stories told over ale and firelight. But to the boys themselves, the knife loomed closer with each passing day, a specter hovering above their every breath. They refused, again and again, clinging to the only certainty they had ever known, each other. Still, the pressure mounted. Each doctor who departed left behind more fear, more questions, more shadows. The twins began to sleep uneasily, their dreams haunted by cold tables and gleaming blades. It was then that they realized the cruelest truth of all. The world did not want them to simply live. The world wanted to change them, to cut them, to bend them into an image it could understand. And so long as they lived joined, they would never truly be safe. Years of exhibition, years of stares, years of whispered threats finally began to leave their mark. The twins were no longer boys, they were young men hardened by the endless rhythm of travel, performance, and survival. The cracks that had once lived quietly beneath the surface now widened with every passing day. One brother grew restless, his spirit untamed even within the prison of their shared body. He spoke often of escape, of vanishing into some distant place where no one knew their names, where no one would pay to see them. His voice carried fire, a desperate hunger for freedom. The other brother recoiled at the thought, weary of change, longing only for peace. He wanted stability, safety, an end to the constant uprooting. Where one saw hope and movement, the other saw only danger. Their arguments burned hotter now, less controlled, spilling into public spaces where once they had forced smiles for the crowd. Audiences noticed. The twins, who had once stood silently in the glow of lanterns, began to bristle in front of paying eyes. A snarl here, a sharp word there, small eruptions of the tension that bound them. Some spectators laughed, assuming the quarrel's part of the show. Others whispered uneasily, sensing truth in the cracks of the performance. For the first time, the spectacle revealed not just their bodies, but their breaking spirits. At home, if such a word could be used for the shifting places where they laid their heads, their mother watched with a heart heavy from years of battle. She was older now, her strength fading. Once she had been their shield, her presence enough to ward off the cruelty of outsiders. But her voice no longer carried the same force. Poverty and age had hollowed her, and the twins felt the weight of her decline pressing on them. The one who longed for freedom now saw time slipping away, while the other feared that without her, they would be left utterly defenseless. Tension seeped into everything. Meals were eaten in silence, footsteps matched reluctantly. Even their laughter, once a fragile rebellion, faded, replaced by grim endurance. The bond that had carried them through infancy, through ridicule, through endless exhibition, was fraying. Each brother felt trapped not only by the world but by the other. And there was no door they could walk through to escape it. It was in this crucible of resentment and desperation that the breaking point came. Not in a single violent outburst, but in the slow erosion of patience, the steady collapse of trust. Their quarrels grew louder, more bitter, until their lives became a cycle of eruption and uneasy silence. The world saw them still as a wonder, a marvel, but inside they were unraveling. And as the crowds pressed closer, as doctors circled with their promises of knives and cures, as their mother's strength waned, the twins stood on the edge of choices no child, no man, should ever be forced to make. History does not tell us how their lives ended in exact detail. Records blur, names fade, and the dust of time buries stories that once set whole towns whispering. What remains are fragments, scraps of newspaper clippings, notes from physicians, the occasional line in a diary. Enough to prove they lived, but not enough to tell us who they truly were. And perhaps that silence is the cruelest fate of all. Were they remembered as men or as curiosities? Did the world see them as brothers bound by fate, or only as a spectacle that filled a tent for a handful of coins? We cannot say. What we know is that their story did not echo loudly into the future. It lingered in half-forgotten corners, spoken of more as a curiosity than a legacy. The boys who had endured so much were reduced, in the eyes of history, to an oddity too strange to fully embrace, too human to entirely erase. And yet, silence has its own power. The fragments left behind force us to ask questions larger than their story alone. What does it mean to be whole? To be human? To be judged by the shape of your body rather than the depth of your soul? These questions stretch far beyond Kentucky, far beyond 1829. They haunt us still because in staring at the twins we are, in some way, staring at ourselves. We live in a world that fears what it cannot understand, that reduces difference to spectacle, that often chooses ridicule over compassion. The twins carried that burden from their first breath to their last, forced to embody both miracle and mistake depending on the eye of the beholder. And though they lived joined in flesh, their humanity, messy, divided, defiant, was no different from our own. Close your eyes and imagine them one last time. Two young men beneath the lantern's glow, standing still as the crowd gasps. Joined, inseparable, defiant in their silence. Their lives may have been written in whispers, their ends swallowed by history, but the questions they leave behind are louder than any record. Questions about survival, about dignity, about the fragile line between wonder and cruelty. They were more than a story to be sold, more than a sermon or a sketch in a physician's notebook. They were sons. They were brothers. They were men who endured a life that the world could not understand. And in that endurance, in that haunting silence, lies the echo of something unexplainable. So when we speak of them now, when we breathe their story back into life, we are reminded of the fragile weight of humanity, of how easily it can be overlooked and how vital it is to see it. If you felt their story stir something in you, do not let it fade into silence again. Share it, reflect on it, and remember them. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, of lives hidden in the shadows of history, stay with us. Subscribe, like, and let your voice be part of the echo that ensures they are never forgotten.